Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, sponsored by Workday, ranked best in class in the ERP category for healthcare technology. I am Brooke Murphy, the Custom Content Strategist and Editor at Becker's Healthcare, and for the next hour, I will be your moderator alongside our three terrific panelists for a discussion on preparing for a future of change, why supply chain management is the key to building more resilient healthcare providers. I will begin today's webinar with a brief 5 to 10 minute overview of industry trends in providers' supply chain, focusing on how supply chain leaders are responding and adapting to change, before handing the floor over to our executive guests, who will share a bit about supply chain at their organizations. Joining me today are Michael Darling, Vice President of Supply Chain for St. Luke's Health System, Joe Colonna, Vice President of Supply Chain for Piedmont Healthcare System, and Wynn Fisher, National Healthcare Supply Chain Advisor at Workday. Following our brief introductions, Mr. Fisher will join us as we transition into our panel discussion. Unfortunately, Mark French couldn't join us today, but we have a great set of panelists with us. So we'll go ahead and start, we'll start our panel discussion by diving into some questions we have prepared for you, and then we'll have time at the end of the hour for a question and answer session. You can submit any questions you have throughout the webinar by typing them into your control panel in the space labeled "Enter a question for staff" and clicking send. We look forward to hearing your questions. About a week following the webinar, you will receive a copy of the presentation to the email you used to register. At this time, it is my pleasure to go ahead and get us started. So the first trend that we'll talk about today is consolidation. Standalone hospitals are increasingly rare in today's healthcare landscape, meaning that the average health system supply chain is growing in both size and complexity. Health systems are managing a broader portfolio of non-acute sites than ever before, with care settings ranging from physician offices and ambulatory service centers to urgent and long-term care. Since many provider organizations have transitioned from mostly paper-based systems to almost all electronic, gaining insight into and sharing information with newly affiliated organizations tends to require a lot of integration and technical workaround. And the greater the number of disparate systems, the need to talk to one another, the more money organizations spend trying to maintain and integrate them, and the greater chance for inefficiencies. The next trend we'll discuss is cost reduction. Healthcare providers, as everyone knows, are under extreme pressure to reduce operating costs, and supply chain presents ample cost savings opportunities. Researchers from Navigant found hospitals could slash their supply chain budgets nearly 18% by improving process efficiencies and product utilization alone. Opportunities for improvement include things such as enhanced purchasing compliance, product standardization, and better management of inventory. The next trend that we'll quickly discuss, rethinking traditional distribution and supplier models. If anything, 2018 has been the year of market disruptors. Declining government reimbursement, rising costs, and the pressure to provide high-quality clinical care while operating within a much slimmer margin are driving health systems to reconsider their operating and cost structures, including how they purchase, move, and use supplies. New market players and partnerships show that many industry stakeholders are rethinking conventional distributor and supplier models, as well as hospital-supplier relationships. Deepening its move into healthcare, of course, is Amazon, pushing to turn its developing medical supplies business into a major contractor with U.S. hospitals and outpatient clinics. The move to strengthen its foothold in supply chain, of course, comes soon after Amazon revealed plans in January to collaborate with JP Morgan Chase and Berkshire Hathaway and launch a new company aimed at cutting healthcare costs for their U.S. employees. What's interesting is that when asked about these efforts, Amazon Business told Wall Street Journal that it's building technology and focusing on technology to better serve its healthcare customers and reinvent the typical hospital purchasing system, which is generally done through contracts with distributors and manufacturers. And finally, I think an important trend is data-driven decision-making. Data analytics and technology play an increasingly important role in supply chain strategy. Supply chain leaders rated improving data-driven decision-making as the most critical need in supply chain moving forward, according to a 2018 Global Healthcare Exchange survey. Roughly 60% of those respondents said data and analytics were the highest priority areas for improvement in the next year. So to kind of summarize this up, I think there are 4 main takeaways here. First, that hospital supply chain leaders are increasingly involved in managing a growing non-acute portfolio with a more complicated supply chain. Second, that hospitals' greatest priorities include better understanding costs and driving out both operational and labor inefficiencies. Third, that hospital supply chain leaders are supporting that mission by reassessing how they manage information and technology across the enterprise. And finally, a common theme that transcends all of these trends that is very important to highlight is that healthcare provider supply chains are facing a significant amount of change. And because of that, supply chain in many cases is being asked to lead that change to a higher quality and more efficient care delivery model. Health systems like Piedmont and St. Luke's, as we'll hear, are pioneers for change in process and technology at their organizations as they reassess their approach to long-term value and scale. So with these trends in mind, I will hand over the floor to our guest panelists who will share a little more about themselves, their experiences on the ground, and the sorts of changes that they're making both as an organization and a supply chain. So we'll start with Mr. Colonna. Joe, can you give us an overview of yourself, your organization, and what your health system has been up to?
Sure. Thank you very much, Brooke. Thank everybody for your time today. I know how busy everybody is. Real quickly, I've been in supply chain in some form or fashion, all of it healthcare, for 30 plus years now. I worked both in the provider side, the distribution and GPO side, as well as done some consulting off and on. The last 10 years, I've been here at Piedmont Healthcare and really enjoyed what we've been doing here. When we were initially engaged here at Piedmont, or when I was initially engaged, the goal was to move from being a transactional supply chain to, which was in some ways acceptable 10, 20 years ago, but the organization recognized they wanted to have supply chain be more of a strategic partner. And so we've been on a journey since 2008 to move from transactional supply chain to one that is seen as a strategic partner for the organization. Initially, the team was limited by resources and a perception that the department was stuck in some traditional ways of doing business. 10 years later, the organization has invested in Piedmont supply chain team, not just financially, but also with trust and by participating directly in those elements that are essential for a high-functioning supply chain to be successful. Piedmont has grown, and I'll give you some stats here in a minute, over those 10 years. We're now 11 hospitals, and the mission and scope of supply chain has changed as well. As always, our job one is get things where they need to be when they need to be there. And as with most supply chains, especially in healthcare, job 1A is reduce cost. Supply chain at Piedmont has been successful in those traditional activities of cost reduction, but has also expanded its services to non-traditional areas such as diagnostic imaging repair and purchase services. In addition, I'm very proud to say the team is seen as an internal consultant, and instead of bringing in outside resources, often our team members are asked to engage with other teams, not just in cost reduction activities, but also in facilitation, team facilitation, and also data management and bringing data and data intelligence to the discussion. We are now at 11 hospitals, 2,000 clinically integrated physicians, 22,000 employees, 550 clinics, 24 urgent care locations, and 28 retail clinics. And I will tell you, in my 10 years here, probably 50 to 60% of that growth has happened in the last 4 years. To Brooke's comments earlier about consolidation, we are certainly seeing that in the Atlanta market. We're consolidating. Our friends and friendly competitors in other sectors are consolidating. You've seen lots of announcements. I think in the last 3 years, we've added 4 facilities or other kinds of, meaning hospitals, but in addition to that, lots of clinics and physicians, et cetera. There is still a lot of standalone facilities in the Southeast, and that's something that I think we're all wondering about, is how are we going to take care of those rural markets? The Southeast has a large geographical footprint and a lot of rural areas that need to be served. And there's a lot of conversations happening both at a clinical level and also at a governmental level about how best to make sure that those smaller independent facilities either find partners or are propped up so that those folks out there can get the same level of care that they could see in the city. So that's one of the things that we're challenged, is trying to figure out geographically how to take care of all of our constituents and also our partners. I will say that we euphemistically say that Piedmont is in the metro Atlanta area, but really we now have facilities 100 miles away, another one 70 miles away, and another 50 miles away. So we are rethinking how best to serve that expanded geographic customer base. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for sharing, Joe. Definitely looking forward to picking your brain during our panel. Mr. Darling, can you give us an overview of your organization and your supply chain?
Sure, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with everyone today. My name is Michael Darling. I'm Vice President of Supply Chain Services for St. Luke's Health System in Kansas City. You know, the journey is very similar to what Joe was talking about relative to growth, change, and how do we create a strategy that's going to not only integrate what supply chain does within the organization, but how do we continue to stay ahead of the changes in the marketplace. I think there are three things that have really stood out for us as we have continued our journey. One of them is data maximization. Second one is clinical integration. The third one is channel management. To sort of preface my comments on those, just to give you an idea of the type of growth we're talking about. When I started here about 4 years ago, we were eight facilities, acute facilities, and about 20 clinics. 4 years later, we're now 10 full acute facilities, 7 additional micro hospitals, and then we're now supporting 312 non-acute locations, all within a 100-mile radius of Kansas City proper. Along with that has come, you know, the growth of systems. It's also included the strengthening of our programs, not just with our GPO and our aggregation group, but also our own programs that we are creating in conjunction with the health system. With that, we do have 23 different clinically integrated value teams that work across multiple sectors within the health system. There's been tremendous growth here, but I think part of the challenge and where St. Luke's is going is that we will continue to migrate to more of those teams, because we're able to utilize data in order to drive decision processes. So the three critical things I mentioned earlier: first off, data maximization. While we all, you know, strive to manage our materials management system, our master item file, our contracts, we have to be able to continue to grow to match financial, supply chain, outcomes measures, utilization management, and variance in practice pieces together in order to have a complete view of what we are doing across the enterprise. One of the things that we have worked very hard on and worked with our business partners on is moving from sort of a traditional transactional program and demand related to more of an exchange to exchange program, where we're exchanging all of this type of data so that we fully understand our needs, streamline how we approach providing supplies and services to our respective facilities, but also use that as a way to gauge success of our programs and sustainability of our clinical outcomes. Sort of the second piece that I mentioned earlier is clinical integration. And a lot of health systems have been working on this for many years, and I feel very fortunate that not only our supply chain team, but also our clinical staff and physicians have really embraced the ability to be able to take the data that we've been working on and use that to understand where are we today, what is our cost per case, what are the variances and how we're providing that care, and turning that into meaningful discussions that helps us to make very good decisions on how we're going to continue to support our community, the marketplace. But we have to all remember this is about providing the best overall patient experience and outcomes. And so by clinically integrating our supply chain and driving excellence there, we're able to be part of that solution long term. Sort of the third sort of key area that we've been very focused on is channel management. When we look at where cost reduction is, everyone talks about price and how do we manage that. But I think there's more opportunity in two areas: utilization management, which I just talked about from a clinical integration piece, but then it is channel management and how are we bringing those supplies into the system and how are we focusing that. We have found that over 30% of our savings this year and next year, as we're are projecting, are going to come from improving the channel on how it's measured. So whether it's a typical channel or a cold channel, whether it's med-surg products or pharmacy products or lab products, being able to pick the right way to drive that solution to our end users has really provided us with the ability to reduce inventories, reduce consignments, reduce trunk stock, reduce call-in hauls, and start to focus on how do we maximize data pulling through to make it easier for our clinicians to have access to what they're needing. Sort of lastly, one of the things that becomes very important is how do we measure success? And going back on my clinical experience, one of the things that got drummed into me early on was if you didn't document it, you didn't do it, whether you did it or not. So one of the things that we found to be very successful is to be able to take the data that's generated from all these activities, put them into whether we want to call them KPIs or SLAs, but being able to provide back to your end users a measure of how certain things are going. So whether that's cost per visit, cost per case, fill rates, even to the point of working with our vendors or business partners and understanding what their solutions are to the point of going into risk arrangements. So being able to measure, being able to share what those measurements are drives a sustainable program, which in the long run supports the quality outcomes that we all are searching for long term.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. So between the both of you, it sounds like we have some great diversity in both, and I think both of you hit on some really interesting issues from the logistics of serving rural facilities at Piedmont to Michael, you're discussing clinical integration and supply chain. So both of you bring a lot of expertise to this panel. And at this point, I'd like to begin our panel discussion. So Mr. Win Fisher will be joining us as we talk about the intersection of technology, business management, and this industry change. So Mr. Fisher, I'd love to send the first question your way and get your perspective on what role do you see technology playing in helping hospitals and health systems weather and respond to this change?
Yeah, thanks, Brooke. And I'd like to echo, like Joe and Michael, thanks so much, everybody, for taking the time to jump on the line today. So I'll go ahead and jump into the question. I think it's a really good one. Ultimately, I think that technology has to be able to enable the change that healthcare supply chains are undergoing today, just like Joe and Michael talked about. Because of the rapid pace and the level of innovation required, a lot of these providers are looking to their technology to be able to enable change as fast as they're being asked to change. They're looking really specifically, from my perspective, for technology to support two specific needs. The first one is to continue to add structure and rigor to their business processes. So that's everything from requisition approval to inventory replenishment, et cetera. But at the same time, and almost at the opposite end of the spectrum, be very dynamic, be very adaptable, because their supply chain business processes are constantly evolving over time as their care delivery models change. And so the technology needs to be able to support both of those asks. At the same time, they need a system that can provide them the insights and analytics at the same pace of that change. Analyzing and making changes 1 month at a time or at the end of the month is no longer acceptable. Analytics need to happen in real time and able to support that supply chain leaders that are being asked to make the right decisions in relatively short order. So again, a great question. Appreciate you letting me kick things off. So thanks, Brooke.
So great. So I'm hearing technology in order to help health systems and hospitals add structure to these business processes, and secondly, to also be adaptable and meet these changes head on and quickly. So Mr. Colonna, I'll pose a similar question to you, but more from a business management perspective. What changes are you trying to make in your supply chain as a business? And what capabilities or competencies are you trying to develop in order to do that?
Yeah, that is a good question, and I really appreciated all the comments that I just heard, and I think there's common themes in them. I think technology presents us with some short-term and long-term opportunities, as well as transactional ones, making the transactions that we have to do to get things where they need to be more and more efficient. But then the collection of the information from all the systems that allows you to produce data. And I think what I heard the term real time, and that really is what's happening, that the ability to interface your ERP system with your AHR system to produce, if not real time, much closer to real time than we've ever been able to before, to find out what's really going on. And I like what Michael said about if you can't document it, you didn't prove it. And one of the things that we've done, for instance, in blending those, both the transactional with the strategic, is monitoring our initiatives, be they for cost savings, or in some cases, maybe there's a cost increase associated with a quality initiative. And those are, to me, the really interesting ones, where maybe there was a cost increase, but the cost increase is supposed to be set off or offset by a reduction in, let's say, infections, because that's, of course, one of the things CMS was looking at, say, CLABSI or CAUTI or one of the others. We can do it with the data and what we have, and the blending of what we get out of our EHR systems and the blending of what we get out of our ERP systems. We're able to look at, did that initiative that may have cost us $500,000 more in supplies really result in these reductions that either ensured we didn't get penalties or reduced length of stay or reduced cost in drugs or something else? Did that really happen? And we'll monitor that for a year or more after, depending on the scope. That's just one example of what you can do when you have a blending of these systems. And that's a more recent occurrence. And it also means you have to kind of change your hearts and minds when it comes to how we've done business, because you can't capture that information correctly unless you're not entering the information correctly in the system. And some of that's transactional, building the contracts out correctly in your ERP system, but also transacting correctly when you do that. It's making sure that all of the players have the right information, be they the supply chain that's ordering it, or the vendor supplying it, or the department that's using it. And so to me, what we have to start really focusing on to get to a place that's more efficient and also more effective is standardized work and process improvement. And those two things have to be enabled by technology, because we're not going to get there just by putting manual processes in place. We can try to manually document the heck out of things or try to train people to do things over and over again the right way. But if you can get folks trained to use the systems in the right way and let the systems do some of the heavy lifting relative to what you need, just reminding the customer or the person working in it that if they do things the way the technology needs it to be done, they will be more effective. So the real challenge to me is the interaction of old ways of doing things with the things you need to change in order to enable the technology to do for you what you want it to do. And that's kind of the jumping off point between the old way supply chain used to work and the new way supply chain needs to work to really become more strategic and more part of the larger decision-making process.
Right. So finding that balance, and I think, as you said, between the transactional, the strategic, and using technology to bridge old and new. Another thing I thought that was interesting, that you were mentioning the developing the capability and the competency to not only collect data in real time, but also use it to drive actions and insight in real time. I think that's something that at least I've been hearing a lot in my line of work. So, Mr. Darling, I'll transition over to you. And at your organization, I'll ask, how are you maybe rethinking your supply chain models to serve a patient population that is more aware of cost and more influenced by customer service than any time in the past? And is technology playing a part in this patient, ultimately customer engagement? Two-pronged question there.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's a great question because it's something that we get asked every day. How are we going to continue to drive things? I think before I answer the question, if we look at the trends that we're dealing with, we do have a smarter community. We do have a community that has greater access to information around cost, around how we are being measured. So whether we're looking at HCAHPS scores or how we're being looked at from a CMS perspective, there is a lot of data that's out there that the community and patients and others can look at. It doesn't necessarily mean it's correct, but there is a lot of data that's out there. Sort of a second piece that is becoming more and more prevalent is really the telehealth piece. As a health system, St. Luke's has really reached out into the community, and we're providing a lot of telehealth programs. So whether that's EICU or specialty programs for diabetes or cardiovascular issues, we're starting to use more and more mobile technology to not only reach out to our patients, but also to retrieve data from whether it's the lab, whether it's looking at pharmacy type of things, or in many cases, supply chain. So telehealth and using the classic definition of approach is truly changing not only how we look at our communities and patients, but also the need for availability of data. Sort of the last trend around this before I answer the question really gets into our physicians are becoming more and more educated around what they're looking at. So, for the longest time, it's been, what are the quality measures? What are we looking at from an outcomes piece? We know that from a supply chain perspective, that whether it's the supplies or the services that are being there, that can affect length of procedure, length of stay, readmission rates. So having that information readily available is important. So to answer the question, technology is playing a huge part in this. I think the challenge that from a healthcare supply chain perspective is that we can't put new technology on old processes and old data. First comes, we got to ensure that our data is clean and useful. And then with that, we also have to look long and hard at our business processes, which can be very difficult. I know even within my organization, as we're looking at making changes, it's very easy to get complacent and comfortable with something that's worked for the last 3, 4, 5 years. However, we are challenged, and we have to start looking at how we're going to prepare for 3, 5, 6 years from now. So it's our customers, or our patients, it's our physicians, who is another level of customer, it's our clinicians who are looking for more real-time information. So whether it's information about the product itself, or if it's detailed information about interactions with other products, all of that is out there. Sort of a last piece to this question is that, and I'll just pick on my health system here. If we look at what we are working with our health system to do, there's 23 different systems that either we're providing data to or we're using in order to grab data from different parts of the health system. So whether it's the ERP, the EMR, the MAR, and the list goes on. As we start to look at that, how do we start to use technology to shrink that? So it's not so much trying to create reports as it is having the base data available for those end users to be able to look at it and understand what they're looking for. So whether it's a physician wanting to understand what did that case that I just do cost me, to, okay, if I look at when I use product A versus product B, is there a difference in the outcomes, and how do I use that to make a better decision down the road? Or whether it's as a patient, if you're looking at, well, do I go to, hospital A in this system versus hospital C in a different system? What are their outcomes, and how do they do things? So technology, not only today, is playing a huge part in customer engagement. It's going to continue to rapidly expand to the point of is that the first place our patients are going to touch our system is using technology. And then after they've been in the system and continuing to monitor themselves and what's going on, they're going to use that then as part of their recovery. And if they have a chronic disease process, to be able to stay in touch and provide information to and from the health system. So while it's sort of daunting as to what's happening out there, I think it's one of those things that's pretty exciting. The last comment I'll make on this, on the answer to this, is that when we look at our supply chain model, supply chain for most health systems has been looked at to provide rigor into the process. And this is where supply chain is going to continue to drive success, drive technology. From our part of it is that rigor in the process and ensuring that all of the basic things that we have to do, whether it's from a buying perspective or regulatory perspective, are done, but also the rigor in how do we ensure that based upon that data that's coming out of this technology, how do we continue to provide improvements and support our community at large?
Right. I'll pivot quickly and pose the similar question to you, Mr. Colonna. How is healthcare consumerism and this greater service expectations that Michael was just discussing influencing supply chain models at Piedmont?
So I think that all of the different transparencies and pressures, wherever they come from, have really in the last decade or so allowed organizations to realize just what a key partner supply chain can be. I will say that I've never in 30 years of working in this industry had a CFO say to me, next year I'm going to give you more money. But I think that now the pressures are coming from different places and everybody is feeling it. It's not just the pressure to reduce the cost, the unit cost of a device. It's the pressure to reduce the total cost of ownership of a procedure. And I think that coupled with the fact that more care is being provided outside of the hospital is causing us to have to rethink the logistics, but also where we need to get our information. So for instance, we have a single item master for our entire health system, inclusive of our physician offices. New organizations that come in are brought on board at their physician office relatively quickly to both our ERP system and to our EHR system. New hospitals are usually within a year on our ERP systems, and within a year and a half are on our EHR system, and there's one version of that for the entire system, and that allows us from point of center to see what is going on and what's changing. That coupled with the customer feedback we get through our value analysis programs, and we're very customer focused when it comes to that feedback, allows us to kind of weigh where we're seeing the need to support different mechanisms. I also think we have to rethink some things, and I think some folks may have alluded to this earlier. The job is not just to save every dollar on every device. It's really what's the right way to deliver that device associated with the way we want to deliver that care. And I do think we have to rethink that not all customers are the same, and not all of our constituents need to be served the same way. So the intriguing thing about the Amazon model is not that I think they're going to replace the major distributors for hospitals anytime soon, but they may allow us a different way to serve the smaller unit customers, such as physician offices, that by dollar volume make up a small percentage of our spend, but may take up significantly more time in customer service and managing their needs. So I think we have to be open to embracing just about any model that helps us deliver a better experience for the customer, which should deliver a better experience. And to me, my customers are the caregivers, and those caregivers, if they're allowed to be more efficient and freed up, can then take better care of our patients, regardless of where they're at.
I think that's a really interesting point that you just bring up with technology and using the Amazon reference about how or rethinking how we serve non-acute or ambulatory or these other geographically dispersed places. I think that's very interesting. Something that I actually heard recently that I enjoyed was like non-acute makes up 2% of health systems. 2% of health system spend, but like 30% of their headaches. I thought that was an interesting point. So I think we'll maybe switch gears here, and Mr. Fisher, bring it back to technology and a little bit more of the IT and the tech scene. Vendors and technology are continually flooding the market with apps, bolt-on solutions, et cetera, that promise to improve operations and workflows for providers. In your opinion, are there any technologies that you think healthcare provider supply chain leaders are over-investing their time and resources in?
Yeah, Brooke, thanks. Another good question, and I'm probably going to build off of what Michael and Joe were kind of talking about around the importance of data to the healthcare supply chain. And I'll reference back to what I had mentioned at the end of my last response. It's really, I think, that area that you're asking about is analytics. Providers are investing a significant amount of time, and not only time, but resources into analytics workarounds. So, whether that's Excel, Microsoft Access, macros, SSRS, they're spending a significant amount of time bolting on and integrating additional analytics tools when really there should be a focus on analyzing as much operational and strategic information in the system of record, or the ERP, making that information also not only analyzing and reporting on that information, but making it drillable, making it dynamic, has really proven even more difficult. So I think there's a big opportunity there to not only bring in that data, Michael mentioned kind of bringing it into a single source of truth. Joe mentioned having a single item master. So bring all that data into a single system but then being able to analyze it. And then again, like I mentioned in the last question, lastly, not just analyzing, but taking action on it. So drilling down to the transaction and taking action on that transaction in the system of record. So I think analytics provides that kind of opportunity. So thanks, Brooke.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, now I think Joe, Michael, Wynn, you've all mentioned it, bringing all of this information together. And I think that, that inevitably leads us to this discussion of course, the buzzword interoperability. Supply chain leaders with interdisciplinary knowledge and experience from operations, IT, financial strategy. It's all important in reassessing hospitals' costs and operating structures, particularly as we've discussed, becoming more efficient. As supply chains look to integrate their clinical, financial, labor, purchasing data, Mr. Darling, I'll point this one to you. Do you think that supply chain will be the real driver for interoperability in healthcare?
Well, of course, I'm biased on that. Again, it's a great question, but I am biased on that. From a supply chain perspective, we all want to believe we're the center of the universe. But really dialing that back a little bit, I think, as we look at systems and as we start to really integrate financial, clinical information, human capital information. Part of where we're going and really what we're needing to look at is understanding at that point of care, what made a difference for that patient, particularly going through and understanding that. So that really takes all the different systems working together, and the closer that those are aligned in more of a centralist type point of view, the more that they're aligned and integrated with that data, the easier it is to understand what we need to do and how we need to do it. I think I mentioned earlier in one of the other questions that one of the things that supply chain brings to any health system is rigor and process. And I think that, again, this is one of those things as we start to look at it. So it's rigor in process. It's rigor in how we're using data with our business partners to help make decisions. But internally, it is helping to drive the rigor in how we're looking at outcomes and making decisions to make changes. So whether it's in our EMR and what we have set up as critical pathways for different diagnostic measures, or whether it's looking at hurdle rates and making decisions on life cycle for capital equipment and those types of things. So it all comes into play in how we centrally make that decision. And so when we're looking at integrating the clinical, the financial, the human capital, and all purchasing data, it becomes a powerful tool, not just that supply chain uses, but really it gives us the opportunity to work with managers, directors, and other senior leaders within the organization to help them see that data, use it, and quite honestly be in front of things that are affecting their department and their ability to be able to provide services that are there. Now, supply chain is an integral piece of that. Obviously, if we need to make a change on the clinical side, that means we need to be flexible and understand where that change needs to happen and support it from our perspective. One of the things that St. Luke's Health System really looks at is that we start by looking at what do we need for our customer, what do we need for outcomes, and it's supply chain's job then to help, once that decision is made, to really help work through making that as cost effective as possible, but also helping to sustain that. And again, that's where data comes through and understanding how products and services are used. But then also it gives us feedback on the decisions we've made and whether or not we need to make further changes going forward. So it really is a real driver. Being able to have everything centralized into one system really helps to drive that. And supply chain is one of the many but real drivers of success with that. Just to give an example, one of the things that we do, our system has a program called Value by Design that really, as a system, we all work towards and look at what impacts are we having in the system. Supply chain has been encouraged and embraced in this health system to help be a significant part of that, and we'll continue to do that, but we can only do it with having clinicians and being clinically integrated into our process and helping to drive long-term results. And there are many other health systems that are doing similar type programs and having similar type successes in the marketplace.
Right. That's interesting. So maybe I'm phrasing it wrong. Interoperability, as maybe not so much that as supply chain is a driver for overall process improvement through better data integration or operational integration. Mr. Colonna, I would love to give you an opportunity to respond and also, pose, that similar question. From your experiences and what you're seeing, do you see supply chain as a leader for enterprise change, maybe more so than other departments? And as a supply chain VP, how do you think that, your role fits into initiatives like process improvement and interoperability, et cetera?
Yeah, I don't want to end up repeating a lot of what Michael said, because I think he made a lot of really good points. I think, and I'm sure there's other questions that we want to get to. I will give maybe a different answer to that, which is, I think what's interesting is supply chain now is seen as an equal in the conversation, and that to really understand what the opportunity is, be it to become more efficient, or what we're going to go into a new initiative, or we're going to start to offer a new service, that supply chain is starting to be seen as an important strategic member of that conversation. And not just because we can tell you how much it costs, but because just like clinicians bring expertise, supply chain folks, both from healthcare and non-healthcare, bring a different sort of critical eye to the decision-making process. And that's sort of where leadership to me is sometimes being part of a team and being an equal member in the conversation, and making sure that we're vetting it out, and then supporting whatever that decision is, not because it happened to you, but because it happened with you. From a clearly technology standpoint, systems have never been more dependent on each other. It's for anybody who on the provider side has gone live with Epic recently, and maybe 20 years ago went live with an EHR system and an ERP system, it's very different experience. The dependencies on each other are very different. I don't see them as two separate go lives. I see them as continuation of one go live to bring a new member into the family and up on all of our systems, and they are real-time connections. We make a change in our item master, it makes a change in the charge master, but it also makes changes in other areas. And our business intelligence work, which supply chain is part of, as is finance, as is clinical folks, is dependent on the good information that comes from all those systems to make good decisions. So to me, interoperability means how tightly are those things connected, and how have we been able to reduce the need for human middleware to collect from multiple systems the information we need to be able to provide good information, and how can we monitor that we're getting the results that we thought we would get. So I see it more of an understanding that it's holistic in the approach we have to take, as opposed to always being the leader. I will say supply chain has a leadership role in many cases, but sometimes our role is to be part of a team that's being led by a different department, but our insights and what we can bring to the table are seen as valuable.
Thank you so much. I think that's a terrific note to end our panel discussion on. Oh, sorry, actually, 2 more questions here. Sorry about that, guys. Mr. Darling, I have one for you. During your career, you've seen provider supply chains become increasingly technology-centric. What does this mean from a leadership position for you? What kind of skills do you think supply chain leaders should be looking to develop in themselves and their staff? And how should they be thinking about, leadership and that technology piece?
Well, it's a great question, and one of the things that is very important is the fact that we have to recognize that without constant change and without constant education, we're not going to be able to continue to drive and be part of change. I liked what Joe was saying about, supply chain being part of the solution, part of the leadership, and that is so true. And that's really, in my answer to this, that continues to be part of it, because it's not just supply chain as we're looking at technology. This has to be a concerted effort between multiple groups, and that's where having great relationships within individual organizations becomes really key. One of the standout things, though, besides, making sure everyone can use the basic programs and use the applications that you currently have, I think the challenge really is how do we know what's coming, and how do we really sort of infuse that thought process into the system? As we have looked at it, one of the things that we've used as an example is that we have spent time with local universities working with master's degree programs and in particular supply chain programs, and providing internships internally. One of the things that we found within those internships, and what's been so valuable about that, is that when we have those professionals coming in and looking at things, they're bringing totally new insights to us and challenging why are we doing things certain ways. So when we talk about being a leader and providing leadership, this is about looking at how do we make change in such a way that we can stay ahead of it. How do we encourage our staffs to embrace that instead of just sitting back on older ideas? Not that they're not good, but we have to stay ahead in doing that. And I think, from a skill set perspective, that's really helped us to look and see what it is that we need to be doing and how do we need to change to continue that growth. So as we're looking at it from a supply chain leader's perspective, not only do we need to be looking at how do we use technology to drive change, but how do we use change to manage technology in the long run? And how do we start to really infuse our individual organizations with not just the skill sets, but the talents behind it to help drive it? So it's been real interesting. This is nothing new. I mean, going back in the last 30 plus years, we continue to see technology grow. I think we're getting ready to see a great big explosion in technology, especially around supply chain, being very focused on mobile technologies, real-time information, and being able to use that to change how we manage our decision processes.
Right. Wonderful. So I think at this point, we will go ahead and transition to our audience Q&A portion, just for the sake of time and to make sure that we get some of those in as well. I would like to thank Messrs. Colonna, Darling, and Fisher for that really informative discussion. So as a reminder, audience members, you can submit any questions that you have by typing them into your control panel in the space labeled "Enter a question for staff" and clicking send. So we will try to get through as many questions that we have today with our time remaining. So it looks like the first question that we have here, I will direct this one to Joe. What do you see changing in the supply chain of the future? Which parts of the supply chain have the biggest opportunity for improvement?
Yeah, I think that it's going to be focusing on how we can embrace technology, which we've talked about a lot, standardize the work, and how can we improve processes and efficiencies and stop using that we're healthcare as an excuse for not making some of those changes happen. I've been doing this a long time. In the last decade, I've become kind of born again hard when it comes to data and what technology can do for us. I feel like that maybe there should be an expiration date on experience, and that some of us who've been around a while struggle, even some of us who haven't been around a while, struggle with the change that needs to happen to embrace all of these opportunities. I told my team not long ago that I was concerned that we had this forest of redwoods and this great toolbox of tools, but we kept using a pocket knife to try to cut the trees down because that's what we were comfortable with, even though we had chainsaws and even lightsabers in this toolbox, that we didn't feel comfortable using those tools. And we were going to have to figure out a way to get comfortable to embrace these tools and to really maximize them, because as the things get tighter, the answer can't always be, I need more resources. Certainly you want to resource correctly, but the embracing of technology and what it can do, and recognizing that technology is going to change rapidly. Every 10 years, for a while, you saw something really different and interesting. That's cut to 5, and pretty soon, to Michael's point, there's going to be some really exciting technologies out there, and we can't be resistant to those. We can't try to take those technologies and bend them to our old ways of doing things. So to me, a lot of this is going to be about changing hearts and minds to embrace technology, and then take that technology and make it better by working together to say, okay, this works really well, but this doesn't work. And not using healthcare as an excuse not to be more like other manufacturing industries, but to recognize that there are differences in what we do. But despite those differences, we can embrace a lot more than we have of how other industries have become efficient through process improvement. It's not all technology. Some of it's people, and some people will be able to change like they need to. to be able to embrace that, and some people will not. And sometimes we may need to bring new people in who have new ways of thinking, and we can't let our past history, just because we failed before doesn't mean we'll fail again. And honestly, just because we were successful before doesn't mean in this new environment we'll be successful again. We're going to have to keep our hearts and minds open to all of the things that can help us to get better.
Right, that's a great response. That acceleration of technology, I think, is so interesting as well. So we'll answer this audience member's question. Michael, I'll pose this one to you. How is your organization addressing population health? I feel this will impact supply chain management and forecasting utilization.
Well, the comment and the question is very right on. Population health is something that, as a health system, we're very concerned about. I mean, there are a lot of alliances that get built within systems to help sort of drive that. But part of the supply chain piece from our perspective, and that is that we work very closely with our service line leadership to understand what their goals are for the year, for the next 3 years, for the next 5 years. We also sit side by side with them as we're looking at what type of patients are we going to be treating, what are the needs going to be, and we actually sort of build out a plan of how do we want to approach our vendors or business partners. We do not keep them at arm's length. We keep them very close to the vest and part of our group. So much to the point of is that as we're having those strategy discussions, we include them in that as well. So, with what we're using technology for, what supply chain is doing with population health is really using that to understand who we're going to be treating, what we're going to need to be treating that, what are the trends on a seasonal basis around those, and how do we pre-plan and be prepared for that on a year-over-year basis based upon that information. So that's something that we're very focused on. And again, it has to be across all areas of the health system. So, it is clinicians, it is service line leadership, and we have those very close ties in order to do that. I feel very fortunate that as a system that we've been able to do that, and it's very easy to grab that information and run with it and then use it to drive those decision points.
Great, that's a very informative answer. Thank you so much. And it looks like we have time for just one more question. Wynn, I will pass this one over to you. This audience member wants to know, how does mobile play into how supply chains are evolving and changing?
Yeah, thanks, Brooke. And I'll keep it really brief because I know we're just about out of time. But I think really mobile is more supply chain leaders are going to be asking, why not mobile first? I need to be mobile first in my supply chain. I need to be able to transact and also honestly analyze my supply chain at my, at the point of care, whether that's up on a nursing floor or truly patient bedside. I need to be able to use mobile technology in order to enable my supply chain no matter where I am caring for patients. So I think that's really going to be the main point moving forward. And again, I'll keep it brief since we are out of time.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Wynn. That is all the time that we have for today. I would love to thank our panelists, Joe, Michael, and Wynn. I'd also like to thank Workday. It has been a great discussion, and we look forward to seeing our audience members for future webinars.